What if the foods you call all-American, the ones stacked on your summer picnic table, spooned onto your New Year's plate, and poured into your morning mug, never came from America at all? What if they didn't come from Europe either? What if the crops that built the fortunes of the American South, that fed a hungry young nation, that eventually turned into billion-dollar brands you can name off the top of your head, crossed the Atlantic in the other direction entirely, carried in the memory, the seeds, and the hands of people who arrived on this continent in chains? This is not a small footnote in a dusty history book. This is the foundation of the way America eats, and almost nobody talks about it. Hello, and welcome back. Today we are pulling back the curtain on 10 foods that you have probably called American your entire life, and tracing them all the way back to West Africa, East Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Some of these will surprise you. A couple of them are going to genuinely stop you in your tracks, and by the time we reach the very last one, you are going to look at the most famous American drink in the world completely differently. I promise you that. If you love this kind of hidden history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly the sort of story we tell here every single week. Grab something to eat, ideally something on this list, and let us begin. Food number 1, okra. Let's start in the swampy, humid, gloriously chaotic kitchens of Louisiana, because that is where our first food hides in plain sight. Okra. Those green, ridged, slightly fuzzy pods that show up fried, pickled, stewed, and above all, floating in a steaming bowl of gumbo. Okra feels southern to the bone. It feels like something that has always grown in the red dirt of Georgia and the bayous of Louisiana. It has not. Okra is African. Completely, ancestrally, undeniably African. The plant most likely originated in the region around Ethiopia and West Africa, where it had been cultivated for thousands of years before a single seed reached the New World. It traveled across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, and there are accounts of enslaved women braiding seeds into their hair rather than leave their food, their medicine, and their heritage behind. That is not a poetic metaphor. Seeds were carried across an entire ocean because losing them was unthinkable. Now here is the part that should genuinely stop you. The word gumbo, the name of Louisiana's most famous dish, the pride of New Orleans, does not come from French. It does not come from Spanish. It comes from a West African Bantu word, ki ngombo, which simply means okra. Say that out loud for a second. The dish that food writers describe as the ultimate melting pot creation of the American South is named after an African vegetable in an African language. The okra was the thickener, the backbone, the reason the stew held together, and the reason it had a name at all. And enslaved West Africans did not just bring the seed, they brought the entire culinary logic. The idea of a slow-cooked, single-pot stew, thickened with okra, seasoned aggressively, and stretched to feed a whole crowd. That is a West African technique that is thousands of years old. It landed in Louisiana, collided with French, Spanish, and Native American ingredients, and produced gumbo. But strip it all the way back to the bottom of the pot, and what you find is okra, and an African grandmother's method of making a little bit of food feed a lot of hungry people. Americans think gumbo is the story of Louisiana. Really, it is the story of Africa arriving in Louisiana and refusing to be forgotten. Food number 2, watermelon. I want you to picture the single most American summer image you can conjure. 4th of July, a backyard, a checked tablecloth, and someone slicing into an enormous green watermelon while the juice runs down their wrists. Watermelon is so woven into the iconography of the American summer that it feels like it must have grown here since the beginning of time. It did not. Watermelon is one of the oldest cultivated fruits in Africa, and every single slice you have ever eaten traces back to that continent. The wild ancestors of the modern watermelon grew in northeastern Africa. Recent research points to a sweet, pale-fleshed melon from the Kordofan region of what is now Sudan as the closest relative of the fruit we eat today. Watermelon was being cultivated along the Nile more than 4,000 years ago. And here is a fact that stops people cold. Archaeologists have found watermelon seeds and paintings of watermelons inside Egyptian tombs, including the tomb of Tutankhamun, who was buried more than 3,300 years ago.
Ancient Egyptians placed the fruit with their dead, believing it would nourish them on the journey into the afterlife. This was not a casual snack. This was a fruit important enough to send with the king into eternity. From Africa, watermelon spread across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, but its journey to America came, once again, through the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans carried watermelon seeds in the deep agricultural knowledge of how to grow them in hot, difficult, unforgiving climates. They planted watermelon in their own garden plots across the American South, and it thrived. And here is where the story turns genuinely dark and genuinely important. After the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people grew, sold, and celebrated watermelon as a symbol of their own freedom and self-sufficiency, white society took that image and twisted it into one of the ugliest racist caricatures in American history.
The fruit that African people had cultivated for millennia, that had been buried with pharaohs, was weaponized as a tool of mockery. So understanding where watermelon actually came from is not just food trivia. It is a small act of setting the record straight. The next time you bite into a slice at a summer barbecue, remember that you are eating a 4,000-year-old African fruit that Egyptian royalty considered fit for the afterlife. Food number 3, black-eyed peas. If you have ever eaten a bowl of Hoppin' John on the 1st of January because someone in your family swore it would bring you luck and money for the year ahead, then you have taken part in a tradition that sailed straight out of West Africa. Black-eyed peas, those creamy little beans with the signature dark spot, are not really peas at all. They are cowpeas, and they were domesticated in West Africa thousands of years ago. The cowpea was a staple crop across the Sahel and the Savannah, prized because it could survive heat and drought that would kill almost anything else, and because it put nitrogen back into the soil, keeping the land fertile. When enslaved West Africans were brought to the Americas, cowpeas came with them, sometimes as the very provisions loaded onto the ships. On the plantations of the Carolinas and Georgia, black-eyed peas became a cornerstone of what we now call soul food. Then there is Hoppin' John, the dish of black-eyed peas cooked with rice and pork that is now a Southern New Year's institution. The very structure of that dish, beans and rice cooked together in one pot, is a West African concept. The first known printed recipe for Hoppin' John appeared in a Charleston cookbook called The Carolina Housewife in 1847. But the dish had been simmering in enslaved people's kitchens for generations before any cookbook author thought to write it down. And the tradition of eating black-eyed peas for luck and prosperity at the turn of the year has roots that reach back through the American South and across the ocean to West African customs of eating specific foods to mark new beginnings. Here is the detail I love. Cowpeas were considered lowly, food for livestock and for the enslaved, beneath the notice of wealthy planters. And that is precisely why they survived as an African food, largely untouched and unclaimed, cooked exactly the way people wanted to cook them. Today, the humble black-eyed pea is a symbol of good fortune, eaten by millions of Americans every single January, most of whom have absolutely no idea they are performing a West African ritual for the new year. Now you do. Food number 4, the yam. And this one comes with a twist that trips up almost everybody. Every autumn, on Thanksgiving tables across America, someone brings out a dish of candied yams, soft orange chunks glazed in brown sugar and often crowned with toasted marshmallows. Here is the strange truth. Those are not yams at all. They are sweet potatoes. But the reason Americans call them yams, the reason that word is printed on the can at the grocery store, is entirely African. True yams are a completely different plant. They are large, starchy tubers native to Africa and Asia, with a rough, bark-like skin, and they are absolutely central to West African cuisine and culture. In parts of Nigeria and Ghana, the yam is so important that entire festivals are built around the yam harvest, celebrations of Thanksgiving and abundance that are hundreds of years old. The yam was not just food, it was wealth, status, and ceremony. When enslaved West Africans arrived in America and found no true yams growing, they encountered the sweet potato, a different plant entirely, native to the Americas. But it reminded them of home, so they called it by the name they already knew. The word yam comes from West African languages, from words like nyami, meaning to eat, or the tuber itself. That single act of naming, of looking at an unfamiliar American vegetable and giving it a beloved African name, is how the sweet potato became known across the South as the yam. and the cooking followed the naming. The tradition of boiling, mashing, and sweetening these tubers, of treating them as a comfort food and a celebration food, carries the fingerprint of West African home cooking. So when you sit down this Thanksgiving and someone passes you the candied yams, you are holding a small linguistic monument. The vegetable itself is American. The name, the reverence, and the recipe came from Africa, brought by people who were determined to taste home, even when home was an ocean and a lifetime away. Food number 5, rice. Specifically, the story of how rice made a tiny slice of the American South unimaginably rich, and how that entire empire was built on stolen African knowledge. When most people picture the origins of American wealth, they think of cotton or tobacco. But before either of those, there was rice. And the rice fortunes of colonial South Carolina were among the largest in all of the 13 colonies. Charleston became one of the wealthiest cities in North America, and it happened because of a grain and an expertise that came directly from West Africa. Here is what the plantation owners did not want anyone to remember. Growing rice at scale is extraordinarily difficult. It requires precise control of water, complex irrigation, tidal flooding, careful planting, and a specialized technique for separating the grain from the husk without shattering it. European settlers had no idea how to do any of this, but there was a stretch of West Africa, running through modern Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, that Europeans literally called the Rice Coast, because people there had been cultivating rice for thousands of years and were absolute masters of it. Slave traders knew this. There is strong historical evidence that they deliberately sought out and paid more for enslaved people from the Rice Coast, precisely because of their agricultural expertise. Enslaved Africans engineered the dikes, the floodgates, and the tidal irrigation systems of the Carolina Lowcountry. Enslaved African women winnowed the rice using flat, coiled fanner baskets, woven in a style brought straight from West Africa, a craft that the sweetgrass basket weavers of the Carolina coast still practice to this day. There is even evidence that African rice, a distinct species from the Asian variety, was grown here in the early years of the colony. The result was Carolina gold, a rice so prized it was shipped around the world. And every dollar of that wealth was extracted from African hands and African mines. So when you read about the grand old plantation houses of the Carolina coast, understand what you are really looking at. You are looking at monuments built on West African agricultural genius, uncredited and unpaid, that turned a mosquito-ridden swamp into one of the richest regions in all of early America. Food number 6, peanuts. And I have to be completely honest with you here, because this one has a genuinely surprising root. The peanut plant itself is not African. It is South American, originally domesticated in the region of modern Bolivia and Brazil, thousands of years ago. So how does it end up on a list of foods that came to America from Africa? Because the peanut, and everything Americans love about it, made a round trip. Portuguese traders carried the peanut from South America to West Africa in the 1500s and 1600s. And in Africa, it was embraced completely, folded into stews, soups, and everyday cooking. Then, enslaved West Africans brought the peanut, and their entire tradition of cooking with it, to North America. And the proof is right there in the language we still use. In the American South, peanuts were long called goobers. That word comes from the Kikongo word nguba. Another old Southern word for peanut, pinder, comes from the Congo word mpinda. These are not English words. These are Central African words that survived the crossing and embedded themselves permanently into the American vocabulary. For a long time in America, just like cowpeas, peanuts were dismissed as food for the enslaved and for livestock, beneath the dignity of the wealthy table. They were grown in the gardens of enslaved people and eaten as everyday sustenance. Boiled peanuts, still a beloved roadside snack across the South, are a direct descendant of West African preparation methods. It was only later, largely through the work of the scientist George Washington Carver, himself born into slavery, that the peanut was elevated into an agricultural powerhouse. Carver championed the peanut as a soil-saving crop and famously promoted an enormous range of uses for it. So yes, the plant was born in South America, but the American love affair with the peanut, the words we use for it, the way we boil it and stew it and treat it as a comfort food, all of that came from Africa. Every time you eat a spoonful of peanut butter, a handful of boiled peanuts, or a bag of peanuts at a baseball game, you are tasting a South American plant that only became truly American because West Africans carried its culture across the sea. Food number 7, sesame seeds, or, as they were known across the American South for centuries, bene. Look at the top of a hamburger bun. Look at a bagel, a cracker, a seeded bread roll. Those little golden seeds feel like the most ordinary, background ingredient imaginable. But sesame is one of the oldest oil crops in the world, and the version that took root in America came directly from West Africa, planted by enslaved people who treasured it. Sesame has a long history across Africa and Asia, but in the American story, the key word is bene. Bene comes from West African languages, the word for the sesame seed itself. Enslaved West Africans brought bene seeds with them and planted them in their own garden plots throughout the Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry. They believed bene brought good luck, and they used it exactly the way it had been used in Africa for generations, toasting the seeds, pressing them for oil, and baking them into wafers and sweets. The famous bene wafers of Charleston, those thin, crisp, nutty little cookies that are still sold in the city today as a genteel southern delicacy, are African food at their core. The technique, the seed, and even the belief in its good fortune all crossed the ocean together. For a long time, sesame oil was valued as a cooking oil and even a lamp oil in the South, and its cultivation was driven entirely by the knowledge of the very people who had been enslaved to work the land. Here's the quiet irony. Sesame is now one of the most widely used seeds on the planet, sprinkled without a second thought onto fast food buns produced by the billion. Almost no one who bites into a sesame-topped burger realizes they are looking at bene, a lucky West African seed that an enslaved cook planted in a small garden and carried straight into the heart of Southern cooking. The most anonymous ingredient in American fast food has one of the most meaningful backstories of all. Food number 8, sorghum. This is one that is almost completely faded from the modern American memory, but for generations it was one of the most important sweeteners in the rural South, and it is African to its core. Sorghum is a tall, hardy grain that looks a little like corn, and it was domesticated in northeastern Africa, in the region of modern Sudan and Ethiopia, thousands of years ago. It is one of the great staple grains of the African continent, ground into flour, cooked into porridge, and brewed into drinks across an enormous sweep of Africa. Sweet sorghum, a variety with a sugary juice inside its stalks, spread through American agriculture in the 1800s, and it took off. Farmers would crush the stalks, boil the juice down for hours over a fire, and produce a thick, dark, tangy syrup, sorghum molasses. For poor and working families across Appalachia and the South, black families and white families alike, sorghum syrup was often the only affordable sweetener they had. It went on biscuits, on cornbread, into gingerbread, and straight off the spoon. Making sorghum syrup was a whole community event in the autumn, with mule-driven mills and long nights around a boiling pan. The knowledge of how to grow and process hearty African cereals in a hot climate moved through the African diaspora and into American farming. And beyond sorghum, the entire American relationship with cane molasses, the sticky byproduct of sugar refining that sweetened colonial America and fueled the rum trade, was built on the backs of enslaved Africans laboring in the cane fields of the Caribbean and the American South. Sorghum syrup has faded now, pushed aside by cheap, refined sugar and corn syrup, but you can still find it at country stores and farmers markets, and a new generation of chefs is rediscovering it. When you taste that deep, almost bitter sweetness, you are tasting an African grain that fed and sweetened rural America for well over a century, quietly, patiently, and without a word of credit. Food number 9, coffee. And this is the one that hides behind 100 million American morning routines. Coffee is so tied up with American identity, from the Boston Tea Party to the modern coffee shop on every corner, that most people never stop to ask where the plant itself actually came from. It did not come from Colombia. It did not come from Italy. It did not come from Seattle. Coffee came from Ethiopia. Full stop. The coffee plant, Coffea arabica, is native to the highlands of Ethiopia in a region historically known as Kaffa, and many people believe the very word coffee traces back to that name. The legend, and it is a legend, so take it with a smile, tells of a goat herder named Caldi, sometime around the 9th century, who noticed his goats becoming wildly energetic after eating the bright red cherries from a certain shrub. He tried them himself, felt the buzz, and coffee was born. Whether or not the goats are real, the origin absolutely is. Ethiopians were consuming coffee, chewing the cherries and later brewing the beans, long before anyone else on Earth. From Ethiopia, coffee crossed the Red Sea into Yemen, where it was cultivated and traded, and from there, it spread across the Ottoman world and eventually into Europe. But the entire global coffee industry, every espresso machine, every drive-through cup, every billion-dollar coffee chain, traces its origin back to a wild plant in the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopia still grows some of the most prized coffee in the world, and the traditional Ethiopian coffee ceremony, roasting the beans fresh and brewing them slowly in front of guests, is a centuries-old ritual of hospitality. Here is the number that puts it in perspective. The world now drinks well over 2 billion cups of coffee every single day. In America, coffee became the patriotic drink of choice after colonists turned against British tea. And that entire staggering global habit, that daily ritual for billions of people, began with a plant that only ever grew wild in one place first. Africa did not just contribute to coffee, Africa invented it. Food number 10, and I saved the biggest one for last, because this is the reveal that reframes absolutely everything: the kola nut. You have probably never eaten one. You may never have even heard of it, but you have almost certainly tasted its legacy, because the kola nut is one of the original sources of the flavor and the name of the most famous American product on the planet, Coca-Cola. The kola nut is the seed of a tree native to the rainforests of West Africa. It is naturally rich in caffeine, and for centuries it has been at the very center of West African life. People chewed it for energy and to stave off hunger and fatigue. It was offered to guests as a sacred gesture of hospitality and respect. It was used in ceremonies marking births, marriages, and funerals. Across huge parts of West Africa, presenting a kola nut was, and still is, a profound act of welcome. This was not a snack. This was a cornerstone of social and spiritual life. Now fast forward to Atlanta, Georgia, in the year 1886. A pharmacist named John Pemberton was developing a new tonic drink. And the two star ingredients he built it around were coca leaf from South America and extract of the kola nut from West Africa. That is where the name comes from. Coca, cola, the coca and the cola. The most iconically American drink in history, the red and white brand that is practically a symbol of the United States itself, is named in part after a sacred West African nut and originally drew much of its caffeine kick and its flavor from that very nut. Read that again in your head because it is extraordinary. The drink that the whole world sees as pure Americana carries an African word in its name and an African seed at the heart of its original recipe. Modern Coca-Cola has changed its formula many times over the decades, but that name has never changed. Every red can, in every country, in every vending machine on Earth, still quietly carries the memory of a West African rainforest tree that people treated as something sacred. And that is the whole point of everything we have talked about today. The story of American food is, to an enormous and largely unacknowledged degree, a West African and East African story. Okra, watermelon, black-eyed peas, yams, rice, peanuts, bene, sorghum, coffee, and the kola nut at the heart of Coca-Cola. 10 foods you were told were American, or maybe European, that actually crossed the Atlantic from Africa. Most of them carried by people who arrived here with nothing, and who still somehow managed to plant a garden, cook a stew, and change the way an entire nation eats, forever. So the next time someone tells you that a food is as American as it gets, you have a story ready for them. You can tell them that gumbo is named in an African language, that the watermelon was buried with pharaohs, that the wealth of Charleston was grown by West African rice masters, and that the very name Coca-Cola quietly points back to a sacred nut from a West African forest. This is not about taking anything away from American food. It is about giving credit to the hands and the history that built it. Food is memory. Food is survival. And these 10 foods are living proof that even under the most brutal circumstances imaginable, people held on to who they were, one seed and one recipe at a time. If this changed the way you see your own plate, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we have stories exactly like this one lined up for foods, cultures, and countries that are going to completely rearrange the way you think about dinner. And I genuinely want to hear from you, so tell me in the comments. Number 1. Which of these 10 surprised you the most? Number 2. Is there a food in your own family's traditions whose origin you have always quietly wondered about? And number 3. Which country or culture should we investigate next? I read every single comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape the videos we make. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.